England is in pink here. We have Wales, which is a principality, a separate nation to some extent. You have Northern Ireland and all the challenges that that piece of land presents. And then up here in orange, you have Scotland, okay? Scotland historically was a separate kingdom altogether. And lots of wars and lots of shifting borders here over the years, over the centuries. And it wasn't until 1707 that after the joining of the crowns did they actually do what's known as the Acts of Union in 1707. At one time, Scotland had its own parliament where they did their deliberations and they created laws. And they held that parliament in Edinburgh. There was a separate one for England, and it was housed at Westminster in London. The Acts of Union brought these two parliaments together, and the one that was in Scotland, it shut down, and all the parliamentarians went then down to what would be Westminster, and they started making laws there. Some argue that as soon as they signed this act, there were Scots that were really unhappy and didn't want that union to take place, that they regretted it after it happened. And over the last 30 years, they've been trying to get their parliament back in sincere ways, 40 years even. In 1997, when I was there conducting my field work for my doctoral thesis, there was a referendum. Now let me give you some politics here. Scotland is typically a liberal country. They like their freedom, they like their ability to help each other out, to support each other, and they like to rely on government to help them do that. And during the 1980s, when there were conservative governments in the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher implemented a law that was a poll tax, that you could go and vote, but you had to pay a tax for that. And it was only implemented in Scotland. The other parts of the United Kingdom didn't have this poll tax. And so this really irked Scots, and it kind of propelled that momentum of we want to be independent in many Scots. When the conservative governments ended and the Labour government came about in the 1996, Tony Blair promised that there would be a referendum, that they would talk about devolving powers, taking powers out of Westminster and giving them back to Scotland where they could start up their own parliament again. And they promised a referendum asking Scots, do you want this? And there was two votes. It was a yes or a no. The one vote was, do you want a parliament? Yes or no. If you get a parliament, do you want that parliament to raise taxes? Yes or no. And so there was this big campaign, and at the end of the campaign, thoroughly, there was agreement that yes, they wanted a parliament, yes, they wanted it to raise taxes. So, in 1998, Scotland Act was implemented, and in 1999, May 12th, the Queen comes up and they open up the Parliament. They restart it. Now, not all the powers have been devolved. Issues involving all of the UK in terms of defense, in international foreign relations, certain aspects of transportation, these sorts of things, are all still down in London. In Scotland, they get to make decisions about their education system, about their healthcare system. They get to make decisions about fiscal responsibilities within the nation. So they have this power, and it's not enough for some. There's still this momentum that they want to be independent. And there's actually a political party that is the most populist party right now, the powerful political party, known as the Scottish Nationalist Party. And they're the ones right now that are in charge at the Parliament in Scotland, and they have considerable influence. Their parliament is now housed in what is known as Holyrood. Holyrood means Holy Cross. Rood means cross. And Holyrood is this place right here. And that is the Queen's residence when she's in Edinburgh. So all of this land here is Queen's property, and it's Holyrood Palace. Right across the street from it, you have this interesting modern piece of architecture, and that is the Parliament building. Okay? Built on a former place, there used to be a distillery there. So, fantastic and interesting building. Controversial because it was monstrously expensive. But this is where they meet, and it's what's known as a unicameral deliberative body. That means there's just one house, right? Bicameral means there's two houses, like a Senate and a Congress, or House of Lords and a House of Commoners. They're unicameral, and so when they vote, it goes into law when it comes to the floor before everyone. Most of the work in forming the bill happens in committees. This gives people who are new to the, they call them backbenchers, the ones that don't have a lot of influence in the Parliament yet. The backbenchers, they get to take part in the Scottish system. All right, they get more say, they get more influence than the folks down at Westminster. There's 129 seats. These are divided up in interesting ways. They have different constituencies, and they have their candidates, but then they also have regions where it's proportional representation. So whoever gets the largest proportion of votes in a particular region, then those parties get to send parliamentarians to the Scottish Parliament as well. Last year, September 18th, there was a vote in Scotland about whether or not they should be independent. And I was able to visit for 3 weeks prior to the vote, and it was exhilarating. I'd never seen anything like this. The amount of involvement of everybody in this conversation about whether or not Scots should be independent was there. I got in the taxi, and the taxi driver was from Zimbabwe, and he thought I was there for the festival, an arts festival, and I said, no, I'm here because I'm interested in the parliament, or the devolution, the independence vote, referendum. I said, are people quite willing to talk about that? And boom, that's all it took. That phrase I kept with me that whole time I was there, because I was sitting and getting my hair cut, and I asked the lady, she goes, are you here for the festival? And I was, no, I'm here for the referendum to ask questions. Are people open to talking about that? And I couldn't have planned a better focus group, because everybody that was in the place that was cutting hair or getting their hair cut got in on the conversation about, oh, I don't like Alex Salmond, I'm not going to vote for them, or I'm not going to vote at all. It was an interesting opportunity. Now, so they got the chance to decide whether or not they were going to be independent in another referendum, and it failed, but it didn't fail persuasively. A lot of people were kind of frightened into a vote. The political parties of the Labour government, or the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, the Tories, were opposed to this separation. Let me say they were opposed to it openly, in conversation and in their advertisements, in their argument. But there were individuals that were, this could be a good thing. The Scottish Nationalist Party was certainly for the separation between the two countries. And one way that it was kind of, nationalism's an interesting issue. When you have a group of people who identify with each other, they feel like they have the same religion, they are part of the same land, they have the same cultural background. Movements today, especially in Europe, are, because we're a separate people, we ought to be autonomous. We ought to have our own land, we ought to have our own nation. And sometimes these nationalist movements can turn violent and turn quite ugly. That hasn't happened in Scotland, interestingly. And the people who are opposed to independence were worried that this sort of image was what was taking place, that this was just emotional fervor for independence, and it wasn't well reasoned, it wasn't well thought out, and it was just kind of emotion. And the Yes people, the people that were involved in the Yes campaign, were like, no, we're not that kind of nationalists. We're not Braveheart, okay? We're not Braveheart. We're not pretending to be William Wallace or, what is his name, Gibson, Mel Gibson, Australian. And so while this is the image that was feared, what was actually going on was, no, during the Conservative governments, we didn't have representation down in Westminster. We were sending liberal MSPs and MPs down to the government, and so our voices aren't being heard. And then we were punished with this tax by the Conservatives. When Tony Blair came into office, when that government switched, all of the Conservative MPs that were in Scotland were voted out of office. They didn't send one that next government. They were all Liberal Democrat, they were all Scottish Nationalists or Labour, okay? In this last two elections with David Cameron's Conservative government, they haven't had representation in the Westminster. The people in power are Conservatives, and the Conservatives aren't being sent down from Scotland at all. And so they think that because of this because we're not being represented in Parliament, we want to be a separate nation where we could rule ourselves and we could have our own interests being voiced. So the argument that won out was an emotional one. People were afraid of their pensions. They were afraid of not having the promises come through, that the Scottish Nationalists were, we're going to have this, we're going to have this, and all these wonderful, it sounded utopian. It sounded like a great place to be. But they didn't really have how they were going to do this, how they were going to be able to manifest, where they're going to get the money for putting all these neat things together. They kept on saying North Sea oil, North Sea oil, North Sea oil. And so the people who were pensioners or about to be pensioners voted for the union because they wanted to protect their interests. They wanted to protect their income. Lots of promises were made by the Labour government and the Conservative governments. If you stay in the union, we'll have more devolved powers to your parliament. If you stay in the union, we'll rearrange how money gets distributed to Scotland from the common tax that we get from Scotland. And so all these promises were made, and after the referendum, they kind of stepped back from the promises. It's like, okay, we've got your vote, and the issue's closed. So what I'm interested in now is some of these post-referendum attitudes and getting access to them. And I'm also interested then in the role that religion has had in this whole conversation, in this whole debate. We'll get into some of the three things that I would like to do on the field school in a moment. And what I'd like to do now that I've set up the, kind of the climate, I'd like to talk a little more about just the field school and what I'd be hoping to accomplish next summer. First off, the whole field school this time will be in Edinburgh. This is the capital of Scotland, and I lived there 7 years, and I still don't have a sense of seeing all of it. So even though there's 4 weeks, and that 4 weeks isn't enough, 7 years wasn't enough, you're gonna see quite a bit of the city in that time, and you will have plenty to do. There'll be plenty to see if you choose to go. As I say, all sorts of strange things can happen. One year during the festival, I was standing out in front of my flat, and Robert Reich was standing there with it. And I'm, oh, you're Robert Reich, and shook his hand, and then, what are you doing here? I'm a student, blah, 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 blah. One day, sitting in my office at work, I looked out, and Prince Charles walked by with Prime Minister Mbeki. Yeah, and so these sorts of things happen quite regularly. We saw the Queen on the first field school back in 2012. This is where I worked. This was my field school, or my field work, excuse me, for my doctoral work. This is the Quaker meeting house in Scotland, in Edinburgh. I lived in this flat right here as a caretaker to this building. And so a part of my going is to maintain the relationships that I've got with the people here. I still rely on them for information. I sit down and do interviews with them. And they kind of keep me caught up. And so you will be meeting some of these people. They're great, and they're great to learn from. In terms of being there, there's the largest metropolitan park in Europe is in Edinburgh, and it's a small mountain, Arthur's Seat, and this is the view from that. A lot of films are. How many people have? This is an old movie now, but Chariots of Fire. A lot of Chariots of Fire was based and filmed in Edinburgh. And then there's Edinburgh Castle, of course. The project that I'm continually gathering information on then is to look at the relationship between religion and politics. One reason this is interesting to me is Protestant nations in Europe see a decline in religious participation. Religious engagement, going to church on Sunday, is becoming less and less popular. And this is true of Scotland, certainly. There's an interesting organization. It's called the Scottish National Trust, and it's a fund of money. And when they hear of a castle going up for sale, they take their pool of money and they go and they buy the castle. And sometimes, if they can, they make it a tourist attraction. The Scottish National Trust is involved in the Edinburgh Castle. There's lots of stately homes, natural features in the Scottish countryside. They go out and they buy land. And so they are a large property holder. And any one of you could be a part of it. You could send them, okay, here's 200 pounds, or here's 50 pounds, or whatever. You could be a part of it, and you could be a member, and this gets you access to some of those sites. So they make a lot of money, and they hold a lot of land in Scotland. Now, the other interesting organization is what's known as the Church of Scotland. The Church of Scotland holds a lot of land, and they have a lot of money, but the land and the money is collapsing. People aren't going to church like they used to, so there's less money in the offering plate, and there's when you go to a church, there's lots of gray hair, right? And people are dying out, and so there aren't the amount of people to be able to maintain churches. And so, in terms of government, the church has considerable influence. They have a lobbyist group that will lobby for certain positions on certain laws, and they would bring the church's interest and kind of a moral center. They bring that to the conversation in those committees. But as it stands right now, they haven't quite reached parity. If the Scottish National Trust continues to grow, they will outweigh the Church of Scotland in terms of not in terms of influence, but in terms of the amount of money and the amount of land that they have, and protecting the church's interests. And so when I was talking to one of the lobbyists for the church, they were like, this is a big concern for us. The other problem in terms of religion in Scotland is that there are fewer people going into the ministry. And so there might be in certain regions of Scotland a minister that will kind of rotate. They'll go to one kirk, and then the next Sunday they go to another kirk, and they go to another kirk. And so they have this sort of rotating schedule. There aren't enough pastors or priests to get involved and actually lead the flock, if you will. So what is the influence of religion in the political conversation, and how do they stand, and what are their concerns is one of the things that I have been looking into over these years. What started me on that was when they opened the Parliament, a delegate from the Church of Scotland that was going to be the main liaison traveled around to the different church organizations, and he was saying, look, we're setting up this lobbying group, we're setting up this office to bring concerns of the church to the Scottish Parliament, right? And he gave this presentation to Quakers, and he said, we don't want to lock the door behind us, that when they open the door to us, we want your voice to be there as well, that we want your interest to be mentioned as well. So that got me writing notes really quickly and having interviews and talking about this. So my notes go back to 1997 on this particular issue. All right. I also want to look at what reveals the religious decline in Scotland. And one way that I want to do that in this next trip is to go and do a hard target search to the different buildings in Scotland, go to neighborhoods, and look at where churches once were. Look at the architecture. This building right here was a nunnery. It's now called the Three Sisters. It's a pub complex. Okay? This one right here used to be a Methodist church, a prominent figure in the history of Scotland, once preached here. This one here is called Finnegan's Wake. It's an Irish bar. And this one right here, that one right there is called the Liquid Rooms, I think, still. When I looked out my window, I could look right down on that. And, interesting things that happen in Scotland. One time, I looked out my window and there were two very drunk people in semi-dress being awfully amorous with one another. I said, whoa, that's not something you see every day. This one is a former Catholic church. It's still up for sale. They haven't turned it into apartments or a pub complex yet. This one, former Church of Scotland, and it likes to be ironic here. It's called Sin, and it's a meat market. And then this one here is called Frankenstein, another pub. Now, some of these kirks are empty. There's nothing in them. And so what I want to do is I want to go and look at the churches that have been repurposed, all right, and then look at the ones that are derelict. And there are other buildings that once served as church offices, and these are now made into flats, made into apartments. So I want to, with the field crew, I'm going to have a form and we'll take pictures and I'll send you out to different safe parts of the city and you'll help me document these buildings. So, we did an informal version of this in the first field school, and one of the field participants was at Sin, and she did an informal interview with the owner. And I'd like to get access to some of the owners and actually have some interviews with them if I get a chance. Okay, did I just go backwards? Oh, what is the role? I've already discussed this. This isn't the inside of this. This is the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. So all the pastors in the Church of Scotland, which is Presbyterian, all the religious leaders come together and they make once a year they make a decision. They form a decision-making body to talk about the role of the church, where the church is going, and how it should be managed. Edinburgh is interesting in that Robert Louis Stevenson was once a resident there. This was his home. He wrote the book Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and it was based on a person that was actually resident, Deacon Brodie, that was actually a citizen. In the day, he was this upstanding political figure, and at night, he was a cat burglar. And so he was sneaking into people's homes and stealing things. And then there are crypts underneath the city, and he had an understanding of these crypts, and so he kept his skeleton keys there, and he kept some of the things that he stole from people's homes down in these vaults. But it's also, the city is, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is also looked at as a metaphor for Edinburgh itself. It's got these beautiful buildings, it's got this rich history, but also there's, as I've kind of indicated, with people trying to have sex with each other out in front of a pub and that sort of thing, there's this dark side. There's this dark side. It gets revealed in things like Train Spotting, the movie, and homelessness is really bad in this city. One of the things that's kind of a thing that Scots like to joke about is when the General Assembly meets in Edinburgh, the Edinburgh prostitutes complain of being overworked. Okay? So it's kind of got this moral gloss, but also it's got the interesting Mr. Hyde aspect to it. The last time I went, back in 2014, I was able to start gathering information on a different set of people, moving away from Quakers, but still being involved in kind of the peace movement of Scotland. I started interviews with folks at what's known as Fastlane Peace Camp. This is an interesting situation. This is Fastlane Naval Base right here. It's about 35 miles north of Glasgow on the west coast of Scotland. The United Kingdom, Great Britain's nuclear arsenal, is all housed on Trident submarines, okay? And all of those submarines are moored or harbored here in Scotland. If Scotland goes independent, where do those submarines go? The Scottish Nationalists, the SNP, they've already stated that if we go independent, it will be a nuclear-free nation, all right? And so these will have to find a new home. And there's only two other locations, and they're both in England, where there's a harbor that could be developed to be able to house these submarines. As soon as this harbor was established, across the road in this little thin sliver of land, a peace camp formed. And lots of, these things are ancient, old campers. I don't have a picture of them. These old camper vans are stuck, and there's little shanties and lean-tos and this sort of thing, and people are resident at this peace camp on the side of the road, demonstrating against Fastlane and against the nuclear arsenal. I conducted interviews last time because I wanted to know, so what is your position on independence? And I figured it was a no-brainer. Thank goodness I asked. Because some of them were like, well, we don't want nuclear missiles here, but we don't want them to move down to England as well. We want them gone. And so some of them were indifferent, and they weren't going to vote in the referendum. Others were, yeah, this will be one chink in the armor, and if we can get them out of Scotland and nobody wants them in their backyard in England, this might be the chance to get rid of this nuclear deterrent as it's regarded. And so another aspect that I like to look at is their religious understanding. What religious motivation, if any, and again, I'm glad I asked because a lot of them that I interviewed were actually Marxists. And so they were atheists, and there's no religious morality here. This is a morality of humanity, a humanist one. But the thing that I like about them in terms of an anthropological issue is they are willing to give up their freedom because of this political position, because of this cause. And so I like talking to them about that. What motivates you to give up your freedom, go to jail because you've chained yourself to the gates of the fast lane nuclear base? They've got a special police crew that has the relationship between the police and these demonstrators is interesting because the demonstrators will fully disclose everything about themselves. And I am this person, on this day I'm going to go and stand in front of this gate and chain myself to it. Okay, you can come and get me when I'm done. And so they're very upfront, they're pacifists, and so there isn't a sense of threat here from the police. And there's some sympathy even, that the police, and they get to know each other. These individuals have chained their wrists together, and they've done that inside an iron pipe and a PVC pipe. And so the police have to figure out how to get these people out of these restraints to try and get them in jail, basically. And so they have a special squad that, okay, and it's like a puzzle for them, you know, how did the Chinese handcuffs, how do we get these people out of here so that we can get them carried off? So yeah, this is really interesting. And while the field school won't be traveling as a group to Fastlane, I will be going. And if anybody wanted to spend their own money and come with me, they'd be welcome to do so. It wouldn't be too expensive. But take a day trip to Helensburgh and then up to Fastlane. Okay, so I'll be continuing gathering information on that. Now, in terms of the field school, students that go along will be learning a set of skills, and one will be informal interviews. I'm doing away with the formal interviews. So an informal interview could happen at the pub, it could happen at Starbucks, it could happen in conversation, basically. But what you do in the semi-structured interview is you have a topic that you want to talk about. I'm interested in religion, or I'm interested in politics, or the interaction between the two. And oftentimes, you've got a person who's willing to talk. Now, I'm touching on topics. In polite company, there are 3 things that you're not supposed to talk about. Do you know what they are? Religion, politics, and money. Yeah. We'll leave the money aside, probably, but religion and politics. But people are quite happy, quite open to do this. Then you also then take notes and you write them up into field notes. And so you'll learn how to do this skill and how to do transcription if there's actual recordings. We'll do participant observation, and you'll record your activities in field notes, and we'll learn how to organize those. We'll do the architectural survey, and so again, another way of documenting. And I'm going to be setting up some questionnaires and sending students out to actually do Likert scale sorts of social science. So I'll get to personal time in a bit. So qualitative data collection will be the emphasis. Semi-structured interviews, transcription, participant observation, field notes, architectural survey, questionnaire, and then the processing and the management of this data. Show you how to get this all into Max QDA. Okay. The field school is going to be summer session 1. All right, and it will be the whole summer session 1. So when that summer session starts, we'll be meeting, like Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and that will be a lecture on architecture. It'll be a lecture on Scottish history. The folks at International Studies will come and they'll talk about how to be a safe traveler and a good ambassador from IPFW and the Anthropology Department and me. And then we'll also do IRB training. Because we will be dealing with human subjects on this, you will have to basically get permission to be able to go out and gather data. So there's through Purdue University, there's an online training session that you have to take to become certified. On May 16th, then we jump on a plane and we fly to Edinburgh. And we don't return from Edinburgh until June 16th. That's 4 weeks, more or less. And again, researching political activism. In week 1, we're going to be tourists with a purpose. I will be kind of a tour guide, but then what we'll do is we'll get together in the mornings. There'll be a particular topic that I want to cover, or there'll be some kind of mini lecture, and then we'll go to, say, the Museum of Scotland, or some people have been talking to me, we could go to the mosque, we could go to St. Giles Cathedral. There will be certain spots, and then one of them, of course, is the castle. And then there will be little exercises to kind of hone your observation skills and little methods that you could do. So in that first week, course orientation, and then week 2, actually learn the city, have some lectures, and then do little data collection projects. All right. In my first field school there, we stayed here at the Holyrood Apart Hotel, and we stayed in apartments. And each apartment had its own washer, dryer, and kitchen, and that sort of thing. We're hoping that we can manage that again this time, but it looks awfully exorbitant. We'll see. You'll have time for a leisure. Friday and Saturdays, I think, certainly Saturdays. You can, if you want, you can go out and you could go outside of Edinburgh. If you want to take the West Coast train line, it's one of the most magnificent train rides in Europe. This is pictures of Alnwick Castle. This was Hogwarts film set. All right, it's down in England, but there's a tour bus that takes you from Edinburgh to Holy Island, and Holy Island to Alnwick Castle, and you can watch the kids do their broomstick practice. All right. And that was on personal time, and I wanted to go too because, well, actually all 4 of us went. This is Brandon. He went on the 2012 field school. There he is right there with the rest of the Hogwarts misfits. In week 3 and 4, then, we'll start going out and doing the research, okay? We'll go out and we'll do the hard target, looking at the architecture, handing out surveys and having people fill them out, sitting down and talking with people and getting attitudes about Scotland's politics and their religious life. It would be also then when I would go over to Fastlane, and I might even organize some sit-down interviews for myself to conduct, but if somebody shows promise, I might organize a formal interview for a student as well. In week 5, which would be the 4th week that we're in Edinburgh, then we would do some wrapping up. We do data processing. If there were any questions that came up, try to go out and get those questions answered. And do those little touristy things that you didn't get a chance to do, would be the last minute to do that. And then back to our fair city. Week 6 during the summer session then would be coming back and continuing the processing of data. And because this is a 6-credit hour course, there's also a writing requirement. You would then be putting the finishing touches on a paper that would be due at the end of that week. I think the grades are due at the end of that week, so yeah, all right. So, I do want students to know what anthropology is before they go. So I'm strongly encouraging E105 as a prerequisite for this. And if you've taken any of these, that would be helpful too. But in fact, we could score that one out because that's not being taught now. But then also the IRB training, but that would be covered in week 1. Right? Any questions? We don't have a cost yet. There are lots of administrative hurdles, and the last one happened about an hour and a half ago. And so Now we can start to look at what it would cost to live in these accommodations, and do we want to include food? Don't we want to include food? Should we leave from Chicago or should we leave from Fort Wayne? We're trying to shave down the cost as best as we can to make this affordable. Do you remember what the field school was back in 2012?
I don't. It was either 6 or 8. I'm not sure.
Yeah. It's a 6 credit hour course, and so you'd be paying $1,600 in credit hours. That's firm, right? And so what the cost will be from there will be determining what airfare is, what accommodations will cost, that sort of thing. All right? We aim to have airfare included. We always have students leave with personal travel insurance, so that if you need an appendectomy, there's money for that, okay? We don't have to worry about it. We'll have the accommodation in Edinburgh. If it's not a part hotel, it will be something comparable. 4 weeks abroad without a washer and dryer would be misery in those ending weeks. So we're gonna try and find a place that is, and the one laundromat that I knew of in Edinburgh closed like 10 years ago. So it will have to involve, and then entrance fees to Edinburgh Castle. What won't be included, we think right now, are the meals. When you went, the meals were included, and we ate poshly. We ate like kings. I think everybody who went gained at that trip. But one of the ways we could shave off costs is that you have control over your own money on that one. So you've got a kitchen. If you want to buy a dozen eggs and have omelets in the morning, that's cheaper than if we go out and we pay somebody to make our breakfast. And so that's one way to economize. Personal spending money, that was pretty substantial. I think everybody in the field school last time, we had to buy an extra piece of luggage because of all there was a dip in the economy when that field school came back. The pubs were more empty and the tourist shops were moaning. Your phone calls will be on your own, but what happened the last field school, it didn't include internet service at the hotel and it wasn't free, but when I went down, I said, hey, look, we're here this much time. Do you want us back? They said, yes, we do. Can we have internet for free? Yes, you can. So I was able to negotiate that while there, and people used Skype, and Skype is cheaper than, So internet service isn't included, but I will do my darndest to finagle it. Soft drinks, alcohol, coffee, these are all on you. The apart hotel has a Starbucks just around the corner from it, so that was very popular. And of course your passport, you have to pay for yourself. Right now the one firm thing is in February 1st, there's a $500 deposit due. And then at the 1st of March, the outstanding balance is due, okay? It does qualify for student loans. There are scholarship possibilities. So there are ways of finding money to make this happen. I sometimes feel guilty because I look at the number and it's like, that's more than my first car, But it's 4 weeks of wonderful, amazing city, 6 credit hours towards graduation. So in the end, I think it is actually pretty impressive. If you have any questions, drop me an email. I'm going to send this around. So yeah, you can go again. There's some information that the folks in marketing and continuing studies put a lot of effort into, and I really appreciate this. If you're interested, go ahead and take one of these. There's some important dates on this. And contact information. If we run out and you don't get one, please contact me and we'll get the information to you. And if you already know that you want to go, they've got applications here already set up. So come up and get one of those if you're interested. Are there any questions? Yeah.
What was Margaret Thatcher's rationale for imposing a poll tax? She must have had
a lot of people say that it was vendetta, that it was that she was a vicious person, and the exact hostility towards Scotland, it was probably because they didn't fare well in the election. And so to help control the vote against the Conservative government, you impose a tax on people, and if Scots are notorious for being mean, and so discourage the vote by making them pay for it. Something similar is happening in Texas, I understand. They're implementing a poll tax in Texas. So yeah.
So I spent some time in England and Wales before, and this was a few years ago, and there was definitely a strong undercurrent of like Muslim refugees, especially in London and in Hereford. I was wondering if Scotland is having the same experience.
There are lots of immigrants, and it kind of comes in waves. Muslims are a part of the people from Pakistan typically immigrating to Britain. Birmingham is a large center for that. What's interesting is the national dish used to be fish and chips. Now it's curry, it's balti, the national dish. British people favor balti over fish and chips now. So it certainly is having an impact on culture and social life. And so yes, there are Muslims in Scotland, but another wave happened when Poland was accepted into the European Union. All of a sudden the boundaries within Europe are gone, and so people can go to find work. And in Edinburgh especially, a large surge of Polish workers came. And so, it's making an impact on the shop fronts and these sorts of things, where you see a sign and it's in English and it's also in Polish. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Nothing like Oldham, or where sometimes you have the nationalist English fighting immigrants. After 9/11, I was there for 9/11. After 9/11, there was an act of violence on one of the mosques. Someone threw a firebomb into a mosque. And it actually had the opposite effect. All the churches in the area, in the city, came and helped them rebuild and supported them. And there is a big mosque, a prominent mosque in Edinburgh now. They were building it, and it shut down because of the first Gulf War, and then after the second Gulf War, they were able to complete the structure. And it has a prominent fixture in the city as well. So a great place for a lunch, actually. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, thank you for sitting and listening to this commercial. I'd like your help if you're able. I go anyway, and it's just if people came with me doing that, all those buildings in the city and looking at them and documenting them, that's easier to do with a group, right? So thanks for your time.